In this video, we will practice graphing sine and cosine with changes in period, midline, amplitude, and phase shift. The first thing we need to do is factor out the b value. This is the a value. This is the a value. And this is the b value right here. We need to factor the b value outside of the parentheses. I'm going to recopy it just so we can focus on it. We have 1/2 x plus pi over 3. But in order to see the phase shift, we need to take that 1/2 outside of parentheses. The way you do that is by dividing everything by 1/2. So I need to divide by 1/2 here and here. Whoops. All right, I'm dividing everything by 1/2. That will show me what goes inside the parentheses. Obviously, the 1/2s cancel out right here, so I just have x. When you divide by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. So this will be the same thing as 2 pi over 3. I'm taking the pi over 3, and I'm multiplying by 2 over 1. So that gives me 2 pi over 3. So in other words, the function that we're given is the same thing as y equals, let's see, can I scroll over a little bit? Y equals 3 sine 1/2. And now here comes my x plus 2 pi over 3. And then we still have this minus 2 on the end. The point of factoring out the b value is so we can see the phase shift is right here. All right, so the phase shift is the opposite of what you see here, though. Because I have a plus 2 pi over 3, I know that the phase shift will be negative 2 pi over 3. It's always the opposite. So don't make the common mistake of thinking that the phase shift is going to be negative pi over 3. That's wrong. You had to factor the 1/2 outside of parentheses, and now you can see that the phase shift is actually negative 2 pi over 3. Okay, the phase shift tells you the first mark that will go on your number line. So I'm going to put my first mark down right here, and I'm going to call it negative 2 pi over 3. You will always start your graph at the phase shift. Now, I am going to add 4 more marks like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm trying to space them as equally as I can because each one of these marks represents a quarter of the period. So, in order to find the value at each one of these marks, I'm going to have to add a quarter of a period at a time. So it'll be useful to know what the period is, first of all. For the sine function, the period is usually 2 pi. But if there's a b value, then the period becomes 2 pi divided by that b value. So this period is going to be 2 pi times 2, because when you divide by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. And then this will give me 4 pi. So the period is 4 pi. Hey, that's one of the things they wanted us to record. So the period is 4 pi. Let's write that down. But in order to find these other values, I need the quarter period. I'm going to call that QP for quarter period. The quarter period is the period divided by 4. So if I take the period and then I divide that by 4, that's going to give me the quarter period. But that's going to turn out to be pretty simple because that's just pi. The 4's cancel out. I'm going to put that over here on the left-hand side to remind me the quarter period is pi. Okay, let me erase this scratch work. So, in order to find each one of these values, I'm going to add the quarter period. So, I'm starting with my negative 2 pi over 3, and I need to add my quarter period, which is pi. But of course, pi is the same thing as 3 pi over 3. So I'm going to write 3 pi over 3 so that I have like denominators. Okay, that is going to give me pi. Negative 2 pi plus 3 pi is positive pi over 3. So the next value is pi over 3. And I'm going to add another quarter of a period to get the next value. So I'm going to add another 3 pi over 3. And that's going to give me 4 pi over 3. So that's the next value. Okay, let's add another 3 pi over 3. And that'll be 7 pi over 3. So that's what this is. And let's add one more quarter period. And that will give me 10 pi over 3. Okay, great. We have all of the values. It is time to place the y-axis on this picture. Notice that we have a negative value here on the left, and then we have a positive value here. So that means that the y-axis should be somewhere in between. So let's go ahead and draw the y-axis now. Okay, that's not going to help me. All right, so let's put the y-axis just really anywhere in between these two. We'll be fine. All right, here's my y-axis. I will use my y-axis to record the midline. So I've got this value here on the end, this minus 2, which is the k value, by the way. This is the vertical shift. So this negative 2 tells me to go down 2. So if I go down 2, all right, that's going to look like this. So this would be negative 1, and here will be negative 2. I'm going to change the color slightly so you can see this better. Okay, so that is negative 2 right there. This is my new midline, and we should draw that as a dotted line. But I'm going to give myself a guideline so I can draw it straighter. Okay, I kind of missed it a little bit. Okay, so there's my guideline. So we really should set it as a dotted line though, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that guideline to show where to put my dotted line. So this is the new midline because of the vertical shift down 2. So that's one of the things they wanted me to write down. Horizontal lines are always y equals the number, so this is y equals negative 2. Next, I need you to focus on the a value, which will tell us the amplitude. So the amplitude is 3. Be aware that the amplitude is always positive. Even if this was a negative 3, the amplitude would still be positive 3. The amplitude tells you how far above and below the midline the graph will go. So this graph is going to go 3 above the midline. So if I go up 2, that takes me to the x-axis. So I'm going to have to go up 1 more, okay, to positive 1. This will be the high value, all right, the highest point that the graph will reach. I'm going to go ahead and put a yellow line up there. as a guideline. This is optional. You don't have to do this, but it helps me draw a better graph. All right, so that will be my highest point. If I go 3 units below the midline, that will be the lowest point. So here I go. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so this is going to be down here. So this was -2 at the midline. So -3, -4, -5. So this is going to be -5 right here. You know what, for consistency's sake, I'm going to make this purple. Okay, now I've got those 3 key values. Again, I'm going to draw myself a yellow line as a guideline. Okay, we are graphing the sine function. Always start at the phase shift. That's why we made our first mark at -2 pi over 3. We have memorized that the sine function begins at the midline. So my first dot will go right here on the midline at -2 pi over 3. A quarter period later, the sine function always rises to its highest value. Notice that the y-axis is not one of the quarter period marks. So a common mistake is to accidentally use the y-axis. All right, the y-axis is just a place where I could put my vertical shift numbers. But pi over 3 is the next quarter period. A quarter period later, the sine function falls to the midline. A quarter period later, it falls to its lowest point. And one more quarter period later, it rises back to the midline. So the sine function is going to look something like this. And that's it. That's how you graph a sine function with a new period, midline, amplitude, and phase shift. I encourage you to pause the video and try to do this next problem by yourself. So the first thing I like to do is factor out the b value, which is right here. So I've got 2x plus pi over 4. But I want to factor out this b value outside of parentheses. So to figure out what goes inside the parentheses, I'm going to divide everything by 2. So these 2's will cancel out and give me x. When I divide pi over 4 by 2, that's the same thing as putting a 2 in the denominator. So this is going to be pi over 8. Now, that tells me that the original function will be the same thing as y equals 1/2 cosine, and here comes my x plus pi over 8. And don't forget the plus 2 on the end. The point of doing that was to identify the phase shift correctly. The phase shift is going to come from this number right here, but it will always be the opposite of this sign. So because this is plus pi over 8, I know that the phase shift will be negative pi over 8. Had this been minus pi over 8, then I would put positive pi over 8 now. So we always start the graph at the phase shift. Let's put our first mark on the number line and call it negative pi over 8. Next, we will put 4 marks equally spaced on the number line. 1, 2, 3, 4. I put 4 marks because each mark represents a quarter of the period of this function. So we need to know what a quarter period is. To find that, first we need to know what the period is. And for the cosine function, the period is normally 2 pi for the parent function. But when you have a b value, then the period is going to be 2 pi divided by that b value. So in this case, the period will be pi. That's one of the things that we are supposed to record. So let's write that down. Period is pi. But in order to find the value at each one of these positions, I need to know the quarter period. So the quarter period is just the period divided by 4. So the quarter period is going to be the period divided by 4. So I'm going to record that off to the side for a minute. So the quarter period is pi over 4. Because each one of these marks represents a quarter of the period, if I want to find the next value, I can find it by adding a quarter period to the previous value. So I'm starting here with negative pi over 8, but I want to add a quarter period. I want to add pi over 4. So, of course, pi over 4, if you were to multiply the numerator and denominator by 2, gives you 2 pi over 8. So that's another way of saying the quarter period. So I'm adding the quarter period, but I'm going to write it as plus 2 pi over 8, so I have like denominators. That is going to give me pi over 8. Okay, negative 1 pi plus 2 pi is positive 1 pi. So I get pi over 8. So that will be the next value on the number line. Let's add another quarter period. Let's add another 2 pi over 8. That's going to give me 3 pi over 8. So that will be the next value, 3 pi over 8. Let's add another quarter period, another 2 pi over 8. That will give me 5 pi over 8. And finally, let's add one more quarter period. So we're going to add another 2 pi over 8. And that will give me 7 pi over 8. All right, where will the y-axis go? I see we have a negative pi over 8 and then a positive pi over 8. So the y-axis should be between those. So now is going to be a good time to graph that. So let's just put the y-axis in between these two, like this. Okay. Let's pay attention to the vertical shift, which is given by this k value. The vertical shift is plus 2. So that tells me that I need to go up 2 like this. So there's 1 and there's 2. That tells me the new midline. So let's go ahead and draw a horizontal line right here, because this is going to be my new midline. Because here is my vertical shift. Okay, so I've got this new midline. We are supposed to draw this as a dotted line. So let's go ahead and just put some dots on here. All right, that's the new midline. That is one of the things we are supposed to record. So the midline is y equals 2. Now, focus on the a value, which is right here. This is the a value. That will tell us the amplitude. So the amplitude is going to be 1/2. Even if this were negative, the amplitude is always positive. The amplitude tells you how far above and below the midline the graph will go. So let's go ahead and put one more mark above this. So, okay, here's my mark right here. So this would be 3. All right, so I've got 1, 2, and 3. But the amplitude is 1/2 of a unit. So that means the high point of the graph will be 1/2 of a unit above the midline. So I'm going to put a yellow guideline at the halfway mark to help me draw better. So 1/2 of a unit above the midline and 1/2 of a unit below the midline. Would be about like this. This is the cosine function. We have learned that the cosine function starts at its highest value. We always start the graph at the phase shift. So here's the phase shift at -π/8. Cosine begins at its highest value, so my first dot is going to go right here. Ignore the y-axis, because that's not part of our quarter period analysis. A quarter period later, the cosine function always falls to the midline. Then it continues to fall to its lowest point after another quarter period. A quarter period later, the cosine function rises back to the midline, and finally the cosine will rise to its highest point. So the cosine graph will look something like this. Whoa, got a little crooked there at the end, but you get the idea. So that's how you graph a sine and cosine function with a new period, midline, amplitude, and phase shift.